Welcome back to Compassion Over Silence. Today we're talking about leadership, not leadership as a title, not leadership as a rank, not leadership as a position. We're talking about leadership as responsibility. A few weeks ago, I completed the FBI-LEEDA Trilogy, a three-part leadership development program that took me through 3 intensive weeks of learning, reflection, and conversation about what it means to lead people well. When I first signed up, I enrolled for a lot of the same reasons many leaders do. I wanted to grow. I wanted to learn from people with different experiences. I wanted to better understand organizational culture, leadership, decision making, and how to effectively lead people through change. I've spent much of my career in public service. I've supervised people, mentored officers, managed programs, coached young athletes, and led projects in both policing and the community. But one thing I've learned is that leadership is a journey. The moment you think you've arrived is probably the moment you stop growing. So I showed up expecting conversations about strategy, command presence, management, accountability, organizational culture, and leadership frameworks. And to be fair, we talked about all of those things. But what surprised me was how often the conversation came back to people. No matter what topic we were discussing, whether it was organizational culture, discipline, ethics, recruiting, liability, crisis leadership, or employee wellness, eventually the conversation found its way back to people, trust, relationships, credibility, belonging, communication, purpose, the human side of leadership. And sitting in those classrooms, I found myself thinking about something I've come back to over and over throughout my life. People rarely leave because of a policy. People rarely stay because of a policy. People remember how they were treated. They remember whether they felt valued. They remember whether someone listened. They remember whether someone cared. They remember whether they felt seen. As I reflected on the trilogy, I realized that many of the lessons being taught weren't really new lessons for me. They were reminders, reminders of things I had learned growing up, reminders of things I had learned as a police officer, reminders of things I had learned through motherhood, therapy, friendship, loss, leadership, and writing permission to break. The courses gave language to things I had felt for years, but perhaps hadn't fully articulated. Leadership is not just about what you accomplish, it's about how people experience you. And that realization stayed with me long after the training ended. Because when I think about the leaders who have had the greatest impact on my life, I don't remember their titles. I remember how they made me feel. I remember how they treated people. I remember whether they were consistent. I remember whether they showed up. I remember whether they lived the values they talked about. And that's where I want to start today's conversation. Because one of the biggest lessons I took away from this training is this: leadership begins long before anyone gives you a title. One of the first concepts we discussed during this training was the difference between positional power and referent power. Positional power comes from a title, a rank, a position. Referent power comes from trust. It's the kind of influence people give you voluntarily. As we were having those conversations, I found myself thinking about the people who shaped me long before I ever knew what those terms meant. I grew up in Northeast Portland. Like many kids, I was influenced by a lot of people who never held any official authority over me. They weren't my supervisors. They weren't executives. They weren't chiefs, commanders, or elected officials. They were teachers, coaches, neighbors, friends' parents, family members, people who saw something in me before I could see it in myself. When I think back on my childhood, I can still remember certain adults who made me feel like I mattered. They encouraged me, they challenged me, they expected something from me, they paid attention. At the time, I didn't think of them as leaders. They were just people who cared. But looking back, they had tremendous influence, and that influence had nothing to do with authority. It had everything to do with trust. The older I get, the more I realize that some of the most important leadership lessons I learned happened long before I ever became a police officer, long before I supervised anyone, long before I sat in a leadership classroom. I learned that people are drawn to authenticity. I learned that people remember how you treat them. I learned that people will work hard for someone who believes in them. And I learned that caring about people is not a weakness. It's one of the most powerful forms of leadership there is. I've also experienced the opposite. Most of us have. We've all encountered people with impressive titles who struggled to earn trust, people who relied on authority instead of relationships, people who expected respect because of their position rather than their actions, people who could tell others what to do, but couldn't inspire people to want to do it. The training reinforced something I've observed throughout my career. Leadership and authority are not the same thing. You can possess authority without influence. You can have rank without respect. You can have a title without trust. And eventually, people notice the difference. Because while authority can require compliance, it cannot create commitment. Trust creates commitment. Trust makes people want to follow. Trust makes people believe in the mission. Trust makes people feel safe enough to bring their best ideas, their concerns, and sometimes even their mistakes forward. One of the recurring themes throughout the trilogy was that credibility is earned through consistency. People watch what leaders do far more than they listen to what leaders say. They watch how you respond when things go wrong. They watch how you treat people who can't do anything for you. They watch how you handle pressure. They watch whether your actions align with your values. And over time, they decide whether you're someone they can trust. As I sat in those classes, I found myself reflecting on the leaders who have had the greatest impact on my life. Some wore uniforms, some carried titles, many did not. What they all had in common was that they made people feel seen. They made people feel valued. They treated people with dignity. And they showed up consistently. That's influence, not because someone gave it to them, because they earned it. So here's the question I've been thinking about since completing the trilogy. When you look back on your own life, who influenced you the most? Was it the person in charge, or was it the person who cared enough to invest in you? For most of us, the answer tells us everything we need to know about leadership. As I continued through the FBI-LEEDA trilogy, another word kept showing up over and over again: credibility, not charisma, not confidence, not authority, credibility. The instructors talked about credibility as the foundation of leadership. They described it as the combination of character and competence. In other words, people need to trust both who you are and your ability to do the job. That lesson resonated with me because credibility has been a part of my professional journey from the very beginning. When I first became a police officer, I wanted to prove myself. I think that's true for many of us when we enter a new profession. We want people to know we're capable. We want to earn respect. We want to show that we belong. As a young officer, I spent a lot of time focusing on performance, learning the job, building confidence, developing skills, trying not to make mistakes. But over time, I realized something. People were paying far less attention to what I said than they were to what I did. They watched whether I showed up. They watched whether I followed through. They watched how I treated people. They watched how I handled stress. They watched how I responded when things didn't go my way. And the same thing is true of leadership. People are always paying attention, not because they're looking for perfection, they're looking for consistency. One of the strongest lessons from the training was that credibility is built long before you actually need it. Think about that for a moment. Most leaders think credibility is tested during a crisis, and it is. But credibility is built before the crisis ever arrives. It's built in the small moments, the everyday interactions, the promises you keep, the conversations you have, the standards you maintain, the way you treat people when nobody is watching. I can think of supervisors throughout my career who earned tremendous credibility, not because they were perfect, not because they always had the right answer, but because they were consistent. You always knew where they stood. You knew what they expected. You knew they would tell you the truth. You knew they would support you. And perhaps most importantly, you knew they would hold themselves to the same standards they expected from everyone else. I can also think of leaders who struggled to earn trust, not because they lacked intelligence, not because they lacked experience, but because people never knew which version of them they were going to get. One day they were supportive, the next day they were distant. One day they encouraged feedback, the next day they punished it. One day they talked about values, the next day they ignored them, and eventually people stopped trusting the message because they no longer trusted the messenger. One statement from this training has stayed with me. People can recover from difficult decisions. People struggle to recover from inconsistency. The more I thought about that statement, the more I realized it applies far beyond leadership. It applies to parenting. It applies to coaching. It applies to relationships. It applies to friendship. It applies to life. As a mother, my daughter doesn't need me to be perfect. She doesn't need me to have every answer. She doesn't need me to never make mistakes. What she needs is consistency. She needs to know that my values are stable. She needs to know that my love is stable. She needs to know that even when we disagree, she can count on me. The same thing is true when I'm coaching. The players don't need a perfect coach. They need a consistent coach. They need to know what is expected. They need to know that accountability applies to everyone. They need to know that effort matters. They need to know that someone believes in them even when they're struggling. The same is true in supervision. People don't expect leaders to know everything, but they do expect honesty. They expect fairness. They expect consistency. They expect leaders whose actions align with their words. As I reflected on this lesson, I realized credibility isn't really something we build during major moments. It's something we build every day, one conversation at a time, one decision at a time, one interaction at a time. Because leadership is not measured by what we say we value. Leadership is measured by what we repeatedly do. And over time, those repeated actions become our reputation. And our reputation becomes our credibility. The question isn't whether people are watching, they are. The question is what they're learning from what they see. The more we talked about credibility, trust, and leadership, the more another theme kept emerging. In every course, in every discussion, and in every leadership model we examined, the conversation eventually returned to one thing: people. People matter. It sounds simple, almost too simple. Of course, people matter. But if that's true, why do so many people walk through life feeling unseen? Why do so many people feel disposable? Why do so many people feel like what they produce matters more than who they are? One of the concepts discussed throughout the training was that people are an organization's greatest asset. I understood what they meant. But if I'm being honest, I've never really liked that word. Asset. I know it's commonly used in leadership circles and organizations. It's not wrong, but every time I hear it, something in me pushes back because people are not assets. People are people. They are mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, partners, caregivers, human beings carrying stories, responsibilities, grief, hopes, fears, and struggles that most of us know nothing about. And maybe that's one of the reasons this lesson resonated with me so deeply. Because over the last few years, I've had the opportunity to work with the Sunshine Division. For those who aren't familiar, the Sunshine Division helps provide food and support to families throughout our community. On the surface, it might look like we're delivering groceries, but if you spend enough time doing this work, you quickly realize we're delivering something else too: dignity, relief, connection, hope. I've met families who are doing everything right and still struggling. I've spoken with parents trying to decide which bills could wait another month. I've listened to people apologize for needing help. I've heard the embarrassment in their voices when they shouldn't have felt embarrassed at all. And what I've learned is that many people aren't just carrying financial burdens, they're carrying emotional burdens too. They're carrying stress, fear, uncertainty, pride, shame, exhaustion. And most of the time, they're carrying it quietly. I think that's one of the reasons I started this podcast, because I know what it feels like to carry things quietly. I know what it feels like to function, to perform, to show up, to keep moving, while carrying things that nobody else can see. And if we're honest, many of us become very good at it. We become good at smiling, good at working, good at helping others, good at being strong, good at convincing the world we're okay. Meanwhile, we're carrying things that feel incredibly heavy. One of the things I've witnessed over and over again, whether in policing, leadership, coaching, community work, or everyday life, is that people don't necessarily need someone to solve all of their problems. What they often need is for someone to see them, to acknowledge them, to listen, to treat them with dignity, to remind them that they matter. And that realization changed the way I think about leadership, because leadership isn't just about performance. It's not just about results. It's not just about productivity, it's about people. It's about creating environments where people feel valued, where they feel safe enough to speak, where they feel respected, where they feel like they belong. One of the discussions during the trilogy focused on employee wellness, organizational culture, and retention. We talked about why people leave organizations. We talked about morale. We talked about trust. And as I listened, I found myself thinking about something much bigger. What if people aren't leaving because they're weak? What if they're leaving because they're tired? Tired of not being seen. Tired of not being appreciated. Tired of carrying more than anyone realizes. Tired of believing that their worth is tied only to what they produce. The truth is, appreciation is powerful. Being seen is powerful. Feeling valued is powerful. Not because people are looking for praise, because people are looking for connection. They're looking for evidence that they matter. And when people feel invisible long enough, something begins to happen. They disengage. They withdraw. They stop sharing ideas. They stop trusting. Sometimes they leave physically. Sometimes they stay and leave emotionally. And that isn't just true in organizations, it's true in relationships, it's true in families, it's true in friendships, it's true in communities. Which brings me back to the lesson that kept surfacing throughout the trilogy. People matter, not because of what they produce, not because of their title, not because of their rank, not because of their accomplishments. People matter because they're people. And maybe that's the leadership lesson I needed to hear most. Not because I didn't already know it, but because sometimes we need reminders. Reminders to slow down, reminders to check in, reminders to ask one more question, reminders to look beyond performance and see the person standing in front of us. Because the reality is this. Every day, we encounter people carrying burdens we know nothing about. The coworker who just received bad news, the parent trying to hold everything together, the employee questioning whether they're appreciated, the friend who says they're fine, the person sitting quietly in the meeting, the neighbor who seems distant, the teammate who suddenly isn't themselves. How many people are walking around carrying heavy things while still showing up every day? As I reflect on completing this training, I realize that many of the lessons weren't really about leadership at all. They were about people. They were about trust. They were about relationships. They were about dignity. They were about the responsibility we have to one another. And perhaps that's why these conversations stayed with me long after the training ended. Because leadership isn't just something we practice at work, it's something we practice at home, in our friendships, in our communities, in our families, in the small moments when nobody is watching. The truth is, every one of us has influence. Every one of us is shaping someone's experience. The question isn't whether we're leading. The question is how. Are we creating trust? Are we creating belonging? Are we creating environments where people feel seen, valued, and respected? Or are we so focused on results that we've forgotten the people standing in front of us? As I've gotten older, I've become less interested in titles and more interested in impact, less interested in authority and more interested in relationships, less interested in being right and more interested in understanding. Because at the end of the day, people may forget what position you held. They may forget what title appeared on your business card. They may forget the accomplishments listed on your resume, but they will remember how you treated them. They will remember whether you listened. They will remember whether you cared. They will remember whether they felt safe, respected, and valued in your presence. And maybe that's one of the most important leadership lessons I've learned, not from a classroom, not from a textbook, but from life. People want to know they matter. So maybe that's the question we should all carry with us, not just as leaders, but as human beings. When people leave a conversation with us, when they leave a meeting, a classroom, a team, a friendship, or a relationship, what answer are they carrying to that question? Did I matter here? Because if the answer is yes, we may have accomplished far more than we realize. If this conversation resonated with you, follow the podcast, leave a review, and share it with someone who may need it. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Leadership, humanity, honest conversations,